Our first session is called People and Perspectives, sharing a lot of the political science and humanities work that's happening within the CanCO2Re project. And so I'd like to invite up Melanee Thomas. Melanee is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Within the CanCO2Re initiative, she's coordinating the activity on public opinion surveys and the merits and limits of CDR technologies. Thank you.
Okay, good morning all. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm chairing the first session, and you'll note we are none of us engineers, but we are heavily empirical. And so I think the thing I want to frame the entire session with, and I will probably repeat it several times, is please avoid making assumptions about what you think people should do and instead focus on what they actually do. They are profoundly different things. And as the expert in public opinion in the room, I can tell you people will never do what you think that they should, so we should just focus on what they do instead. I'm going to introduce the panel briefly. I understand that we probably won't use these chairs until the Q&A time comes, and even then, yeah. But we have a delightful panel of folks. So I'm presenting with one of the postdoctoral fellows who is on the project, Anna Watson, if you can give a wave. Anna Watson is a postdoctoral fellow in political science, my department at the University of Calgary. Within the CanCO2Re initiative, she is involved in both the public opinion survey and the focus groups that are also to come with my colleague, Dr. Roberta Rice, who is sitting there. She's a professor, and she's also the head of department in political science at the University of Calgary. Within CanCO2Re, she coordinates the activities on unintended consequences of CDR and on the focus groups. And Mack Penner. Matt could give a wave, excellent. He's a postdoc studying the history of energy transitions at the University of Calgary. And again, within CanCO2Re, his work looks at the social implications of CDR based on historical examples, because nothing is new under the sun. Okay, so I am very good at ignoring things, so I also have my timer here. The plan is for each of us to take about 20 minutes for our presentations to leave some time for questions so we can, yeah, carry on. Okay. And how am I advancing the slides?
A big button.
This one? Ah, perfect. We do not use such fancy technology when we teach at the University of Calgary. Okay. So Anna, if you want to come and join me for this, we will set the timer and yes. Okay, so to start, we're going to kick off with what people think and feel. As Dr. Gates mentioned, without knowing what people are prepared to go for, particularly in the context of what they're prepared to vote for, this might be a total non-starter even if we have the best technologies available to us. So I'm going to present on the crash course on what you need to know about public opinion and how people think and feel and react to these sorts of things. Anna will present on the limited research that we have on public opinion in CDR as it stands now, and then we'll present some original data gathered in the context of the project. Okay. So we have some enduring generalizations about public opinion, and this is where the stereotypes and, again, those normative expectations will not serve you well. And so, again, we're focusing on empirical generalizations about what people actually do. The economists in the room, political science has borrowed from economics to come up with this way of understanding the way that people behave called rational choice. And it doesn't work because it makes the assumption that people have perfect information, which for me is the reason why I never use it, because I know that people don't have it. So coming from different perspectives, there are some enduring things that structure how people think and feel and behave. Who we are consistently matters. So if we're talking about gender, race, religion, and religiosity, so not just the type of religion somebody has, but how devout that they are. Where they live, place often exerts important perspectives, age, all of these sorts of things. Who we are forms the core of the stability of public opinion. And so if you're looking for the things that help keep things stable over time, those enduring generalizations, who we are matters. And so this is also one of these things where we cannot understand how this stuff works without understanding other social structures like racism, sexism, xenophobia, all those sorts of things. It comes in right from the jump. The other things that strongly structure, and I think are the things that need to be understood the most, are the values and beliefs that structure how people react to new information. There are several of these. We teach whole university courses all the way up to the doctorate level about this stuff. The basic one that you need to understand is partisanship and motivated reasoning. I've highlighted these two for two reasons. Partisanship, the idea behind it that has the most empirical evidence is that it acts as a perceptual lens. So who somebody is may inform their partisanship through parental socialization and the like. This would be, I vote this way because my father voted this way, because his grandfather voted this way, so on and so forth, right? What it is it acts as this, think about it as colored glasses through which the political world and the rest of the world is understood and interpreted. The mechanism behind this is something called motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning is when there's information that confirms your priors. People tend to put more value on it. They agree with it. They're like, they don't question it. They're like, yes, that seems great. The priors work both ways. So if we're thinking about it in terms of partisanship, if it's information that's good for your preferred side, awesome, you don't question it. If it's information that's bad for the people you don't like, you also don't question it. Where the intense questioning comes when it comes for things that are not good for one's preferred side, or if they're good for the other side, then people start to really interrogate that kind of information. And when I teach this to students, I ask them, think about when you actually really start to challenge an idea. Like, when do you just accept it without thinking about it too much? And when do you actually really start to be like, nah, I actually don't think that that's true. So again, I'm going to repeat myself, the normative is not the point. The empirical is that everybody does it. So it's less about is it a good thing or a bad thing that this happens, and more about the fact that this is how the world works. Connect this to the current information environment that we find ourselves in. So I'm old enough to remember when everybody had a landline telephone, and I grew up in rural Alberta, which meant that we had a party line in the 80s, and I know that I am not the oldest in the room, so I can imagine other people understand these experiences. Back then, because of the way that the census was set up, and because pretty much everybody had a landline telephone, we had an excellent proxy population list, which meant between the census and the phone book, we got excellent sampling and we could understand a great deal about the population. The internet has, also I should say at that time, we also had similar news outlets. There were maybe like 3 different broadcasts on the farm. We had 3 channels, so we knew that we had like the 3 broadcast news. There was a paper of record. There were local journalists, so you knew that you actually had lots of beat reporters and things. And I should say, even between when I started at the University of Calgary in 2012 and now, the number of people who are actually doing the important work in journalism to get information to put it into the news has catastrophically reduced because the business model doesn't work anymore. So what we have is a fracturing of the information environment because of the internet. The internet has done lots of useful and wonderful and, like, again, normatively good things, sure. But what it means is that there isn't a consensus about what the facts of record are, not like there was before. What this means is that people are getting their information from wherever they want to. And back at when this all started, we thought, what an excellent democratizing force on the normative assumption that people would go and do their own research and search out information to get this kind of nuanced, deeply informed. And this is not what people do. Okay. You'll need to spend a little bit of time on social media and also like picking your social media platforms to know that this is not how people do it. Again, when I teach this stuff, I think, I don't get my news from social media. I use my Instagram for cats and for knitting and for running. I work really hard to curate the algorithm so that it's cats and knitting and running, because I kind of don't want to get anything else in that particular space, right? So these information environments, they're fractured, and in particular when it comes to CDR, they are low, which means that assume people don't know anything about this, because that's empirically the best bet that you're going to make, which means that what are they going to use to interpret the information as they get it? Things like partisanship, motivated reasoning, other kind of enduring sorts of things based on sociodemographics. If you want it in a picture, this is the standard kind of political behavior model that we use. This is used to explain vote choice around the world. This is from a particular piece that I published looking at attitudes about energy transition. Energy transition asking, should we move away from fossil fuels? And for this particular piece, we only looked at Albertans, and we asked about renewables as a separate question, and can confirm in this context, in 2019, a majority of Albertans said we should move away from fossil fuels, which is not the understanding that you would get from the news or from the statements of the government of Alberta. So again, public opinion, don't assume that the way people vote is also how they think and feel. It's complicated, that's not how this works. So social background, the way that the arrows works, there are direct effects and then there are indirect mediated effects. So the social background characteristics, they tend to have a very small effect in the end because they're working through things like differences in underlying values and beliefs. These lead to political orientations, like ideological orientation. And again, if you're thinking about ideology, most people are not forming it based on a systematic view of the policies or the ideas that they like. It's about whether or not they feel more comfortable or at home on the left or on the right, or neither. And in Canada, it's that neither that does a lot of work as well. Unlike in the United States, this is one of the things that makes Canada very different. There's lots of political orientation about the, I don't like any of it. So no, none of these. We've got economic and climate perspectives. Things that we found in past work is basically being a bit glib, but how Reaganomics, if somebody's really into like this idea of like business should be doing everything and government should be doing nothing, this has powerful effects on how they think about the stuff that's the content of what we're working with on today. There are reasons, we can go into those in the Q&A if you like. Climate perspectives are things about if they believe in anthropogenic climate change, like is it people? And are they worried about it? And sometimes, is it people? Yes, is the thing that's driving it. Sometimes it's the, I'm actually really worried. And that's, again, not consistent. And then news media is basically the bit of information that they get. Look at the information there. It's at the very end. And it's being filtered through all of these sorts of things as well. Okay. So, with this background in mind, I will turn it over to Anna.
Thank you, Melanee. So, we have a very limited research about CDR acceptance. Most of the previous literature has been shown surveys in Europe and the global north, and some in US, a little bit less in Canada. With that in mind, there's one single truth, like people usually haven't heard about CDR before. And that means that there's not necessarily that people don't care. It's just that they didn't have the opportunity to have that information. So that put us on a low information environment. And the other thing is that there is a consistent path that once people heard about CDR, they care and they want to engage. And some of the key factors for that is trust, how risk is perceived, and the sense of fairness, the governance. Thinking about previous results, data has been shown that people prefer nature-based solutions over engineered solutions. But that necessarily means that engineered solutions are rejected. It's just that support for CDR engineered solutions varies across the different socio-technological context. That means that we don't have an homogeneous support for CDR all across the different surveys. It's just, it depends on the context. For a Canadian survey, what does it mean, as Melanee presents? It is more than a technological choice. It's more than a technological fix. It needs to be understood in the social political context. And that's what we try to do with this type of surveys. Another thing that we have learned from the literature is that trust should be, or seems to be, one of the key components for the support of CDR. But it's not just trust on the technology. It's also trust on who is behind and how it's implemented. So it's a complexity to try to understand how trust actually works for CDR technologies. In the same sense, with how we perceive risk, especially in low information environments, we have that the perception of technical risk is not enough. Surveys in other countries also includes the socio-environmental risk, like land use change, the moral hazards of how these technologies could be perceived as delaying emissions on greenhouse gases, and also the procedural risk, like transparency and how people can access the benefits. However, it also is complex to understand how risk could affect the support for CDR or the acceptance of CDR. In fact, there is some clear patterns of this. In some contexts, moral hazard seems to have a significant effect on the acceptance of CDR, while in other contexts it's not. So what does it mean for our survey? That not just that we have limited information to try to understand how we can implement a study to explore CDR in Canada, but that means that CDR should be explored as a social political factor as well, and not just as asking people if you agree, yes or no. We also try to understand how the different social demographic factors, identity, politics, place, and awareness of climate change also affect or have some impact on the public's acceptance or opinion on CDR technologies. And that's why we have a really complex survey.
So I don't think the survey is complicated, but I do these all the time. Okay. What we did. Our data collection was completed in the field in October 2024. Our sample is 2,000. This allows us to do modest subgroup analysis. As an aside, in my own work, when I want to do deep subgroup analysis, I treat provinces as countries and take a bigger sample in each province. So this is about the standard. Canadian politics is complicated. There's lots of things that are going on. We ran the study in English and French because place matters. Environics was the firm that we hired for this. We included a conjoint exercise to introduce CDR technologies in this, which include enhanced rock weathering, enhanced mineralization, BECCS, and DAC. I'm going to show you all the things that we included, and then I want you to observe what I talk about. If I don't talk about it in the results, it means it didn't matter, or rather, we do not have evidence that it matters yet. For the social background, we included things like age, gender measured beyond the binary, I would point out, race, income, education, place by province, and place by rural and urban. As an aside, the emerging research on how rural and urban works is that everybody hates the suburbs. Basically, urban and rural folks are actually much more aligned, and the difference usually comes to the suburban area. So as a farm kid, I will also say that the stereotypes that people level against the farmers for being ignoramuses is just that's not actually what the data shows, and yet, just listen to how people talk about rural folk. Anyway. For values and beliefs, we include things like the big five in personality in psychology, and this has been well studied, it's been well critiqued. The reason why we included it is that personality is seen to be one of these things about people that is enduring and doesn't change. And one of the things that we have is if you're giving somebody information to something that's brand new, the people who are more open to new things are probably going to be more likely to be oh, I might actually give that a go. I see Stephen Bryant is here, and I remember he asked me at the very beginning of this process, how do we figure out how, if I can't tell somebody what I'm doing, and I don't know how much it's going to cost, and I don't know what the effects are going to be, or the unintended consequences, how do we figure out whether or not they're going to support that? And it's the people who are open to risk and trust you specifically, they might go for it, most won't. Values and beliefs in this, so we've got the personality stuff. We have attitudes towards risk and towards sunk costs. So it's not just being open to risk, but also this idea of we're already down this path so far, we cannot change. And then verified measures from psychology about how trusting somebody is. Here we present generalized trust because it's the workhorse measure. We have alternatives that we will explore in the future. We also include political orientations, ideology in terms of left and right. In the American literature, they talk about it as liberal and conservative. We can't use that way here because they're party labels, and so we would be muddying our concepts. Ideology as left-right and party identification are distinct. They mean different things. The content of what people care about if they identify on the left is different than if they identify on the right, but on the right it is also different depending on the party in the party family that they're involved in as well. So these things are not the same. We also have economic and climate perspectives, so this is attitudes towards the economy. This is everybody benefits if business makes a lot of money, even the poor, government should stay out of creating jobs. We have a measure that is based off of the American measure of polarized partisanship about how people identify in this polarized way with oil and gas. Which we think is doing something. It's doing something for energy transition stuff. We've got belief in climate change, if they've been evacuated due to a natural disaster, and if they've worked in energy in any meaningful kind of way. And so the way that we measure that is like currently employed, not now, but used to be and never was. Okay. So we also have, it's a low information environment, so we do have a control for if people have heard of carbon dioxide removal before. Here's what we find. First, to look at who's heard of carbon dioxide removal. The 13% that say, yes, and I'm confident I know what it is, I won't go into the details here, but we know that this is an overestimate based on decades of research into political knowledge and who lies when they do these kinds of things. And so it is exactly what I would expect to see with the people who always claim that they know more than what they actually do. There's a huge gender gap on this, by the way, and I will leave you to apply stereotypes to figure out what direction that's in. Okay, do people think that carbon dioxide removal is realistic? We've got a scale here where not at all is a 0, very is a 3, the average is somewhat, which is, again, what we expect from public opinion research. People kind of pick in the middle. This is new. So one of the things that we find is that there isn't a whole lot of stuff that significantly moves people into thinking that carbon dioxide is more or less realistic. I should say, we're using, when I say academic versus commercial methods, if you've ever hired a public opinion firm and they do the analysis for you, they don't do it the way that we do. We do it properly. They give you a simplified version that's easier to understand. So we're describing, we're not doing causal inference here. Pictures. Okay, remember, our measure runs from 0 to 3. I'm totally going to take 3 more minutes because Anna doesn't have her own presentation. Yeah, okay, cool. So remember, it runs from 0 to 3. We've got a common axis here, 1.4 to 2.2. So we're basically at the lower end. We're below average. So lots of people are sitting here and thinking that they don't think that it's realistic. So we're moving people, what moves people to think that it's more or less realistic. For those of you who do the empirical research, these are 95% confidence intervals because it's a sample. I have to see if I am confident that the effect is not 0 or that it actually exists in the real world. So if those little spiky things overlap, it's 0. Or I don't have evidence to say that it's not. Things we've pulled out. Top left is I've heard of carbon dioxide removal. And you'll note, you know how I said I didn't think the people who said yes and confident were telling the truth? Yeah, because they're not that different from the people who said, I've never heard of it before. Okay, but this has a small effect, I guess. What matters more, top right, how open somebody is to risk. The more somebody inherently is I'm prepared, they have a big risk appetite, the more likely they're going to be like, yeah, this seems realistic. People who are less risk open or less likely to engage in risk are like it's about a 0.5 point on a 3-point scale, so it's, in terms of meaning, like that's a pretty big shift. Trust also matters. This is generalized trust. One of the things that we're going to explore is if it's trust in who. I can say trust in the oil and gas industry is low, but it's not as low as trust in the federal government. And one of the things that comes out too is that people think that both oil and gas as an industry and the federal government share responsibility for this particular thing. And so they're the least trusted, but the ones seem to be most responsible. And also the sunk cost fallacy, that's the bottom right, that's doing some work there as well. Okay, like I mentioned, who should be responsible for carbon dioxide removal? About 60% of the sample rank the federal government and the oil and gas industry in the top 2, and their plurality category is number 1 for both of them. So for those of you who are on the more kind of so how do we actually get this done side of things, that's where people think that you should be talking to. Regular folk is down at the bottom. Consistently, supermajority is saying regular people do not bear the responsibility for this. There's lots of noise in the middle about this stuff, people kind of don't know how to rank the renewable energy industry, I think in lots of ways because they don't know how they feel about it, because it's newish. I don't know the difference in people's heads between oil and gas and big business. what drives behavior is the image that somebody has in their head. And so that there is a distinction between oil and gas specifically and large corporations or big business. It's doing something meaningful there. Okay. Canadian political scientists can't help but point out that provincial governments probably actually have the constitutional responsibility for all of this, which means the fun times that we have with federal-provincial relations that have characterized the past couple of years in Canadian politics will continue, because that is the conversation that needs to be had here as well. Okay. That's it for us. We have lots of other information that we can talk about, so if you have questions, please ask. In the meantime, I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Rice.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'm Roberta Rice. I'm a co-lead on this activity with Dr. Stephen Bryant, professor in the Department of Chemical and Petroleum Engineering in the Schulich School of Engineering here at UCalgary. We're fortunate to work with two fantastic research assistants, Dr. Elton Diaz dos Santos and Mustafa Majidi, who's a doctoral student in the Department of Political Science. Very nice. Our activity explores the potential pitfalls and unintended consequences of the rapid deployment of new carbon dioxide removal, CDR technologies for Canadian society, including technical, environmental, social, cultural, political, and economic aspects. The objective is to avoid or mitigate possible negative consequences in the rollout of CDR technologies at scale. So what I would like to present for you today is our research question, our approach, and our findings thus far. So the central research question that we are working on right now is what explains the unintended consequences of emerging green technologies? We are hoping that by uncovering the causal mechanisms that produced unintended consequences in past technologies, that we can use this understanding to avoid or prevent adverse unintended consequences in emerging technologies such as CDR. Right, so our research approach, we rely on the causal process tracing method, which is a critical form of within-case analysis to analyze prior cases of green technology rollouts and map out their unmodeled or unexpected outcomes. While predominantly applied to policy analysis, process tracing can be adapted to the study of the implementation of new technologies as a means of better understanding how to avoid consequences or unintended consequences in the future. We employ this process tracing method in 3 case studies of green technology spanning 2 countries, so Brazil and Canada. Specifically, we have been analyzing the cases of Brazil's National Ethanol Program, Ontario's Electric Vehicle Incentive Program, and Alberta's photovoltaic system development. We've already published 1 co-authored paper on the Brazil case, which we've done the most work on. If you're interested, it's available open access in the Canadian Journal of Latin American Caribbean Studies. It's titled From Green Revolution to Green Technology, The Unintended Consequences of Brazil's Ethanol Program. And we're currently working on a new co-authored paper for potential publication in the journal Global Environmental Politics that will draw on the findings of all 3 cases, as well as a series of transdisciplinary workshops we've been doing with the project. And we're hoping to sort of bring all the cases into conversation with each other. Okay, so how do we trace processes? Right, so process tracing is a qualitative research method. It involves a systematic examination of pieces of evidence that contribute to supporting or overturning alternative explanatory hypotheses. It seeks to uncover the causal links between causes, X, and outcomes, Y. In other words, it tells the story of how and why events unfold in the way that they do. And there are 3 different variations or variants of process tracing. One is theory testing, which is based on a deductive approach. Researchers search for evidence that a hypothesized causal mechanism is or is not present in a case, which is a theory-centric design. B, there's theory building, which is based on an inductive approach whereby researchers examine the sequences of events observed in a case under consideration for the purpose of generating new variables or hypotheses. This is a case-centric design. And C, outcome explaining, based on both inductive and deductive logics to develop a causal explanation of a specific case. So in sum, process tracing places this emphasis on explanation. So how do we actually do process tracing, right? So in process tracing research, we're tracing causal mechanisms or factors as they operate within a case. Processing takes the form of X caused Y through the process of ABC in case Z. Causation resides in the interaction between the mechanism and the context within which it operates. It is highly contextual, meaning that only inferences about the operation of the mechanism within the studied cases are possible. So the goal is to find diagnostic pieces of evidence of probative value in discriminating between alternative explanations. Process tracing involves several different kinds of empirical tests, focusing on evidence with different kinds of probative value. So based on an informal Bayesian logic, 4 such tests have been developed to confirm and eliminate potential rival hypotheses based on process tracing evidence. And this evidence can be drawn from primary documents, from interview transcripts, focus groups transcripts, secondary literature, all sorts of sources. So this table here depicts the 4 process tracing tests for establishing causation in the literature. So the first test is called the straw in the wind test. It provides neither a necessary nor sufficient criterion for establishing a hypothesis or correspondingly for rejecting it. Such tests may provide valuable benchmarks in an investigation by giving an initial assessment of a hypothesis. If a hypothesis passes multiple straw in the wind tests, it adds up to important affirmative evidence. The second test is the hoop test, which provides necessary but not sufficient criterion for accepting a potential explanation. The hypothesis must jump through the hoop just to remain under consideration. A hoop test proposes that a given piece of evidence from within a case should be present for a hypothesis to be true. And then third is the smoking gun test, which provides sufficient but not necessary criterion for confirmation of a hypothesis. This test strongly supports a given hypothesis, but failure to pass such a test does not eliminate the explanation. So the metaphor of a smoking gun conveys the idea that a suspect who is caught holding a smoking gun is presumably guilty, but those with no smoking gun may not necessarily be innocent. So if a given hypothesis passes a smoking gun test, it substantially weakens rival hypothesis. And finally, the gold standard, the doubly decisive test, which provides necessary and sufficient criterion for confirming one hypothesis and eliminating all others. Double decisive tests meet the standard for establishing causation. In other words, if a piece of process tracing evidence passes the doubly decisive test, it can potentially change the historical interpretation and theoretical significance of a case. The challenge for the purposes of our research activity is that process tracing is designed for analyzing evidence of what actually happened and not what could hypothetically happen. So we cannot study the evidence of unintended consequences of CDR technology deployment as it is too new. So instead, we're trying to better understand and explain the unintended consequences of prior cases of green technology development. So we understand unintended consequences to mean the unanticipated or unmodeled policy outcomes that were not initially considered during the policy decision-making process. So unintended consequences can be classified as either A, positive or negative effects that may occur alongside the desired effect of the policy or action, or B, the effects that contradict or undermine the original intent of the policy or action. So our interest lies in advancing knowledge of how to avoid and or manage unintended consequences. The so-called law of unintended consequences states that for every action there is an unanticipated or unintended outcome, and that the actions of people, and especially of government, always have effects that are unanticipated or unintended. So how can we possibly manage and or avoid adverse unintended consequences? By being able to understand and explain why they emerge in the first place. So authors James Suckling et al. In 2021 put forward an analytical framework of unintended consequences based on 4 categories that we have found very useful for our work. So these categories, which are depicted here, are those that are knowable and avoidable, those that are knowable and unavoidable, those that are unknowable and avoidable, and finally those that are unknowable and unavoidable, the most difficult category, a wicked problem in some cases. Right, so knowable and avoidable. These are manageable unintended consequences. They can be foreseen, and the actions needed to avoid them are relatively easy to implement, which is why Suckling et al. Deemed them as unforgivable unintended consequences. Knowable and unavoidable. These are inevitable unintended consequences. These can be predicted, but the actions that need to be taken to avoid them are either uncertain or difficult to implement. And third, unknowable and avoidable. These are mitigable unintended consequences. They cannot be predicted or foreseen, yet once they arise, it is still possible to act to lessen their impact. And then finally, in that last category, unknowable and unavoidable, these are unmanageable unintended consequences. They are the most difficult to predict and avoid. Unmanageable unintended consequences pose the greatest risk to the planet and require the greatest research effort to increase our understanding of them and the precautionary measures needed to counteract them. They require possibilistic rather than probabilistic thinking to imagine what possibly could go wrong when deploying new technologies at scale so that potential measures could be put into place to counteract potentially adverse impacts. So where we are now, right? What have we found thus far in looking at these cases, right? In contrast to the literature by engineers on unintended consequences, which argues that unintended consequences of novel technologies tend to arise from internal technological design problems, we are finding, based on our case study analyses, that the unintended consequences of green technologies are the result of external socio-political challenges, specifically the actions and decisions of people, especially policymakers. Right, so we're sort of working through all these cases. I can't really present them to you right now, but definitely the Brazil case is the one we have done the most work on. So some of the findings from that case, if I have a few minutes, are like, such as with Brazil tried to implement, or did implement, a huge national ethanol program to actually change the vehicle fleet from running on gasoline to running on ethanol. And they did that in the 1960s through the Green Revolution, which allowed these new sort of sugarcane plants that they're able to grow across the country and use for ethanol production. So one of the knowable and avoidable consequences, which should have been taken into account, was, of course, direct land use changes, meaning, of course, these sugarcane plantations that went into the Amazon region, resulting in deforestation, and of course the production of more CO2 with the burning of the Amazon. Some of the knowable and unavoidable, more complicated, inevitable consequences was the concentration of power in the hands of the landed elites, which are already very powerful historically in Brazil, which just added to their power and their wealth, and sort of the corporatization of the sector. Unknowable and avoidable in the 1980s, with neoliberalism and deregulation and the entrance of the free market policies, which cut policy incentives for encouraging ethanol production and encouraging ethanol ethanol-based cars. There was a shift or return to gasoline cars because it was cheaper, and so that sort of completely shifted it. And then the worst, or most, I guess, intractable problem, unknowable and unavoidable, was this path dependency of technological change, the rise of these flex cars that use both ethanol and gasoline, which actually locked in the internal combustion engine and dependence on gasoline, so because consumers can choose whenever the prices go up and down how much ethanol they want to use, how much gasoline, which actually ends up with a net increase in the use of gasoline in the country, with more carbon dioxide production than before. And then with the Amazon on fire, it actually made things worse, not better. Something of a green paradox, right? When you're trying to help the environment and things backfire and actually make it worse. And the Brazil case is a really great historic example, well documented for us to study, to show that. So now we're sort of looking at the examples from Ontario with electric vehicle car incentives, thinking about technological lock-in of electric vehicles and their dependence on lithium-ion batteries and all of the implications that come with that, of having to rely on lithium and extraction from sites around the world, in fact, impacting Indigenous people's rights potentially. And in the case of Alberta, looking at different moratoriums on renewable energy projects, which are sort of reinforcing dependence, technological lock-in on gasoline and typical internal combustion engines as a potential unintended consequences in the long term. But we hope that you stay tuned to our findings, and we'll look at our publications. And thank you very much.
Can you hear me okay? I'm not too far away from the microphone. This could be as high as it possibly gets. I'll like hunch. I'm used to hunching. Okay, I should maybe start with a bit of an apology. I give this apology quite routinely. I'm working on like some sort of reputation for myself as the guy who never uses slides. So I don't have slides. You just have to look at me as I talk up here. Okay, so what I want to do with my time here today is to talk about what I think is arguably the most common non-technical criticism that gets leveled at carbon dioxide removal and at related technologies. I should get a drink while I'm up here.
Do you want a mic? Yeah. We have a little, we have a... Oh, like a, yeah, like yeah. Yeah, a lapel mic. You want to meet him in the front?
Yeah, that'll be easier. How's that? Okay? Okay, so yeah, again, I want to talk about what I think is one of the most common non-technical criticisms leveled at carbon dioxide removal and related technologies, which is that they can act as a kind of tool for justifying the sort of fossil fueled status quo and the carbon emissions that go along with that status quo. So I'm sure that in a room like this, with lots of interested people, that most of you will have encountered an argument that goes something like this. So if we permit ourselves to believe that carbon dioxide can be removed from the atmosphere at sufficient scale to meaningfully mitigate the effects of climate change, as this criticism will tend to go, we will, either inadvertently or not, provide cover for the continued supply and consumption of fossil fuels. And then in that process, by sort of disincentivizing efforts toward an energy transition away from fossil fuels, we will lock ourselves into a future of climate catastrophe. And so the point is not always made quite so elaborately, I suppose, but it actually is almost always made. So like explainer type pieces in various outlets are a good example here because they represent a kind of entry point, I think, for people who are curious about CDR, but don't necessarily understand the technology or even the role that it presently plays in combating emissions. And so that is, these are the kinds of things that someone might find themselves reading if they decide one day that they just want to learn a little bit more about CDR. And so along these lines, a quick sampling here. So in the characteristically beige language of the Financial Times, an explainer on both CDR and carbon capture, which for what it's worth, I don't think are nearly so separate in the sort of public mind as they are among people who get the technical distinctions. But this FT explainer notes that the technology is, quote, controversial when used to justify the continued supply of oil, gas, and coal. In the Globe and Mail, the greenwashing risks of CDR are singled out in an explainer on CDR and carbon credits. And a reader of the New York Times could encounter the suggestion that fanciful, quote, fanciful or costly technologies will simply waste resources and time, or lull people with the false idea that it will be possible to slow global warming without phasing out fossil fuels. And so the point I want to make here is basically that this criticism of CDR is more or less everywhere, and that being the case, it needs to be addressed. And so I would say that even on its face, this argument does make some sense. I don't think that it strains credulity too much to imagine that a technology like CDR could come with greenwashing risks. And so surely here we see some general evidence when we see that despite decades now of international agreements to reduce emissions and to combat climate change, and also increasingly generalized awareness that it will be impossible to do that without reducing the production and consumption of fossil fuels, both emissions and fossil fuel production, of course, continue to increase. So in 2024, carbon emissions from fossil fuels reached a new height of 37.4 billion metric tons as countries backtracked on existing reductions commitments. And then also in 2024, last year, in a reversal of what was a somewhat encouraging trend in existence since 2021, private banks have now increased their funding for fossil fuel projects by fully a fifth, or 20%, suggesting that under the more favorable political conditions that the present seems to provide, the supposed sunset industries of oil, gas, and coal do have good times ahead of them yet. And so this all being the case, I think it makes really total sense for people to look around and say, I'm hearing lots of talk about emissions reductions and the technologies that are going to help to do that, and yet all this remains true. So you see where I'm going there. But here, what I really want to suggest actually is that this point, this kind of criticism, can actually be substantiated historically. We don't actually have to just speculate about the greenwashing risks that come with CDR, and actually fossil fuel firms in the past have used the prospect of mitigative technologies like CDR in order to downplay the climate risks associated with their businesses, and thus to provide a kind of cover for more of the fossil fueled same. And I should say, too, that I think it's important to do this here, interested as, of course, all of us are in CDR, for a few reasons, most of which are to do with how discussions about CDR are actually framed. And so leaving any kind of like nitty-gritty technological discussion entirely to the side, in order for CDR to be deployed successfully as one tool among many in the process of a broad energy transition away from fossil fuels, I think it's important that its role is actually broadly understood as such. And so that being the case, to the extent that CDR can be or is used as a kind of rhetoric by fossil fuel companies in order to downplay the importance of an energy transition, its ability to serve its appropriate role on the way to net zero is thereby reduced. Okay, so having set things up like this, I'll move along here by talking a little bit about my research on the Imperial Oil Company, which is where I'm drawing these conclusions from, principally. Imperial, as many of you will be very well aware, is a subsidiary of the super major oil firm ExxonMobil, and for a long time it has been a preeminent Canadian producer with particularly extensive operations in Alberta. So for my work lately with CanCO2Re, I've been working really closely on the Imperial Archive, which is here in Calgary, and which is really quite an amazing resource for researchers. So it's actually worth saying that it's exceedingly rare for researchers to have access to the corporate archives of a firm like Imperial, and we're very lucky to be able to sort of work on and learn from this collection here in Calgary. So Imperial started to pay close attention to environmental issues related to, but still distinct from, climate change as we know it, like as early as the late 1960s. But today I'm going to discuss a period in the early 1990s when the concept of global warming began to sort of take hold in the public mind, if you will. Here, Imperial was very keen to participate in, and then as much as possible to steer that broad sort of public conversation as it developed. And so in March of 1990, Imperial published what it called a discussion paper on what it quite studiously referred to as potential global warming. The very disciplined use of that phrase, potential global warming, was evidently a kind of device to cast doubt on the relevant scientific evidence without explicitly rejecting that evidence either. So, quote, much scientific uncertainty surrounds the debate about the impact that human activities and a buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere could have on global climate, as they put it. But even so, Imperial vowed commitment to being helpful on the climate front, and they indicated several priorities in their efforts to do so. Those priorities included, quoting here, filling in the gaps in scientific analyses, assessing economic consequences for Canada and others, determining a range of response options, and then finally, and most importantly for our purposes here, quote, fostering the development of new technology. And so on the technological front, Imperial's precise commitment, as they described it, was, quote, to determine the technical and economic potential for carbon dioxide sinks or mechanisms to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, such as underground injection into oil-bearing reservoirs to support enhanced oil recovery operations. And they investigated this potential most of all by looking closely at Alberta, where at the time fossil fuel producers in Imperial's calculation, were directly responsible for about 42% of provincial emissions and then 10% of national emissions too. This would make sense given the concentration of the industry in the province. And so it all turns here, Imperial's conclusions with regard to the efficacy of such technology were quite well hedged. So in no way was Imperial trying to say here that the disposal of carbon dioxide underground was any kind of panacea. Instead, they thought, it would be basically a very expensive way to make a small contribution to the reduction of emissions. Quoting here, significant expenditures and commitment are required to reduce current Alberta CO2 emission by only 15% by injection into underground reservoirs, as they concluded. And then more specifically, to reduce emissions from the fossil fuel industry in just one province by 15%, Imperial forecasted that a bare minimum of $7.5 billion, or roughly $15 billion in 2025 money, would need to be spent over 5 to 10 years. And then taking operational costs into account, they thought that this would work out to a disposal cost of about $75 or $150 in 2025 terms per ton of CO2 in hydrocarbon recovery projects, or about $45, $90 in 2025 dollars per ton for just plain old disposal. And then while Imperial was willing to investigate these possibilities, they were not willing to shoulder the burden alone, and nor were they particularly enthused by the contribution that they thought these technologies would make in terms of reducing emissions. Quote, significant investments and a high degree of collaboration among stakeholders would be required, they claimed, apparently suggesting that for the firm, disposal was only appealing if some of the financial and logistical burden was borne by others, and even then, for Imperial, the ceiling was quite low. Such investment and collaboration would make only a, quote, minor impact in reducing CO2 emissions through the implementation of such disposal schemes, as they reiterated. And so perhaps it should seem kind of strange to us. So on the one hand, Imperial was making emissions-reducing technology an important plank of its public campaign as a kind of concerned and well-meaning corporate citizen regarding climate change, to the point, actually, of actively studying this kind of technology in what was, as far as I can tell, a fairly serious kind of way. So on the surface of their public communications, that is, there seemed to be a kind of optimism about the technological possibilities here. But on the other hand, for anyone who would have read their findings in any sort of detail, they actually seemed quite pessimistic, sort of eager to downplay the efficacy of removal and disposal, and also quite eager to emphasize costliness. So now I would argue that this strangeness, such as it was, had really everything to do with Imperial's political economic interests and the way that those interests were sort of valued above others. So mitigative climate technology was important to Imperial, not because I think they were especially concerned to be reducing emissions, but because this was useful for them as a kind of rhetoric with which they could help resist the apparent threat to their business model that was posed by growing awareness of climate change or global warming. And so here, indeed, Imperial actually tied the potential of carbon dioxide disposal directly to its own bottom line when they averred that its development would require both significant oil price growth and a sharing of costs, quote, not only by contributors of the emissions, but more broadly by society. So in other words, Imperial was only keen on this technology if it could be developed alongside a still flourishing fossil fuel industry, and if the cost of its development was broadly distributed among Canadians more generally. So in other words, Imperial was not like signing up to take full responsibility for its emissions here. And again, this made sense. So after all, Imperial understood its broad role in Canada, not just in terms of environmental responsibility, but also in terms of an economic kind of responsibility. So actually, in its efforts to respond to global warming in the 1990s, Imperial even made this explicit. So the first and foremost of what it called its guiding principles in this process was to, quote, strike the balance between environmental and economic priorities. And then in the elaboration that Imperial made of that principle, it was quite clear that the sought balance here was not an even one, and actually economic priorities weighed heaviest on the scale. So here, Imperial argued that Canada's ability to, quote unquote, achieve environmental quality depended first and foremost on its economic health. And so there was no economic health then without fossil fuels. Quote, Canada is to a large extent a country of commodity producers whose prosperity flows from a resource-driven, energy-intensive industrial economy that relies heavily on international trade. This meant that in Imperial's arguably quite convenient view, any action that would impose burdensome costs on fossil fuel producers would be detrimental in turn to the environment because it would be detrimental to the economy. So if Canadian producers face costs relative to environmental protection that international competitors did not have to face, they would become uncompetitive, Canada's economy would suffer, and in the way that this logic works, so too would the environment. So in this way, if we look broadly at Imperial's posturing vis-a-vis climate change in these years, not just its investigations into removing atmospheric carbon, but the way in which those investigations fit into this sort of broader outlook, I think we encounter insights that are important to all of us now as we think about how and whether carbon dioxide removal can contribute to the achievement of net zero emissions in Canada. So even if Imperial's endeavor to understand the potential for disposing of carbon dioxide was undertaken in good faith, it was also, I think, pretty clearly subordinated to the ongoing conduct of business as usual. So in its broad response to climate change, and then particularly in this appeal to removal technologies, Imperial's foremost commitment was always, and not surprisingly, to its own business model of making maximal profit from the production and sale of fossil fuels and their byproducts. So in other words, the rhetorical use of technology to justify more of the same is not just a contemporary phenomenon or a future concern, but at least in this one case, an established practice. So then to conclude here, I want to sort of reiterate some points that I made earlier, and then also to reference my particular role with CanCO2Re, just to be super clear about why I think this is important. So with CanCO2Re, where I work on activity 8, my job is to do historical research that will help us to understand the social willingness to adopt and stay the course with CDR and like technologies. And on that front, what I want to suggest here is that behavior like this on the part of fossil fuel companies threatens to undermine the credibility of CDR in the sort of public mind. And so again, pretty well anywhere that someone looks for information about CDR, they are going to encounter a note of some kind that will indicate greenwashing risk, that will indicate the fact that CDR is controversial because of suspicions that it can be used to distract from the necessity of an energy transition. And so my research here suggests, at least again in this one case, that those suspicions on the part of the public are legitimate. And so for carbon dioxide removal to play its appropriate role in helping us to reach our net zero targets, which would be the role of an attending technology in this broader energy transition, it is important, I think, to understand this dynamic. And then hopefully by understanding that, we can address it not just by acknowledging the public suspicion of CDR as it exists, but by confronting the source of that suspicion too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would invite my panelists to come and stay because we have 15 minutes for questions? 12. I won't go into coffee break, I promise. Briefly, I will say that archive sounds amazing, but also we're in a different part of my life. We are engaging in looking at public-facing corporate reports, which are not the same in terms of disclosure. But post-Paris, the technological optimism that shows up in them sounds very similar to what you're describing there. Anyway, come and join us. The orange chairs are here for a reason. Questions? We have microphones in the middle, so. Stephen, yes.
Can I just shout?
I think we can hear you. Yeah.
So a through line here is that ultimately it's consumers, whether they're imperial customers or go down the line. Do the public opinion or the unintended consequences vary if people are, if you point out to folks, stay warm in winter in Alberta because you're using natural gas, you drive from your farm to the market or to the soccer practice using diesel. But just if we bring this all the way back to people and their role in all of this, does anything change in terms of the things y'all talked about?
So I can't say that with these data, but with other data, and folks that work on the communication of this will point out that it's really easy to demoralize regular folk, like really easy to demoralize them. Which might be one of the reasons why people put them in our data at the bottom of the list of the people who should be responsible for this stuff. And we're working on like trying to explain why. I think part of it is that it's hard to imagine a different status quo. Like the change that we're asking regular people to like think their way through is, I think, more than what most people can imagine. And then to Roberta's point about what matters is political leadership. Like if you've got political leadership that it can help or it can really, really, really hinder what people are prepared to do and what they're prepared to engage in. So to summarize, I guess if you went straight and said to somebody, yeah, but you're creating the problem because you're driving this particular vehicle, you're gonna get a kind of belligerent response back. And I also suspect that after that, that was your single shot to get them to trust you. So they might not listen to you after that. But I don't know if others have thoughts about.
Yeah, so I think that the role of people is very important because people drive politics. People can bring change from below, how they vote, what they want. If they change their beliefs and ideas, then the leaders have to listen to that. And so what I do like about the Brazil case is that they were able to do something huge, completely change the vehicle fleet to ethanol because the government provides subsidies. It made it cheap, it made it available for the masses, and people did it because it made sense for them. And yes, the government failed to think about the unintended consequences and the land use, but had it, like that whole package actually made it possible to completely change cars, the vehicle fleet, which is huge. Yes, it happened during a dictatorship, but that's another story to think about. But the idea that government and policymakers can actually make incentives, a whole package that can actually make things possible, and people will do it because it makes sense for them to use ethanol because it was so well subsidized, and that it is possible to do things differently, and people will do things that make sense for them and could help the planet. It's just a government and people working together with the same sort of idea and priorities it's possible.
Yeah. And to that end, we have repeated public opinion estimates that show that not just a majority, but a super majority of Canadians, like the context that we're in now is like super majorities want action on climate. And so the question is, so why isn't the state reflecting that? And this is where I would go to vote choice is complicated, leadership matters, you know.
The framing also matters because in some research, they have found that when there's familiarity on the trust on previous infrastructures also, it kind of drives certain kind of acceptance of CDR as well. So for policymakers, framing is also important. And perhaps the connection between climate change and biodiversity because of the land use change that seems to have some role in the acceptance of nature-based solutions that engineered solutions doesn't have.
So I guess like not to speak for Imperial Oil or something like this is how I should preface this response, but I do think that Imperial had a sense that that kind of posturing was relevant and useful as like a kind of advertising tool in public publications and these kind of things. They would say to the sort of perceived recipient of this messaging that the comfort we enjoy on account of fossil fuels is obviously very comfortable and kind of sacred. Like you and me both agree that we don't want to sacrifice any of that. And so that kind of posturing was definitely relevant in Imperial advertising and so on.
I have a question primarily for Melanee. I noticed a tension in your survey data, and you highlighted it, that the groups that people say should be doing this are the federal government and the oil and gas companies, and then that they're also the least trusted groups by people. And then thinking about the context that you put forward, Mack, on how this could be used by oil and gas companies, I'm wondering if the group saying that are the people who trust the feds saying the feds should do it, or is it the people who trust the oil and gas companies saying the feds should do it because it's not oil and gas? Like, are they cross kind of answering? So if you trust oil and gas companies, you think it should be a federal responsibility, not on your industry, and if you don't trust the oil and gas industry, do you think it should be the feds?
It could go a number of ways, and I don't yet know. But to describe the data, it's a 0 to 100 scale. So it's basically when somebody picks a 0 on those trust scales, it means that they have no trust in the named thing. And if they pick 100, that means that they have like maximal trust in that thing. And so if we're talking about the least trusted, I'm looking at the zeros, where for oil and gas, it's like 6% picked 0, which, and like 8 picked 0 for the federal government, compared to, thank goodness, scientists employed at universities where we were at less than 1% in the 0 category. So silver linings about these sorts of things. But because it's a 0 to 100 scale, there's lots of variation. And so I would hypothesize, so it could be that people who are saying the federal government either think that the federal government is best placed, or they want the state to use its power of coercion to force oil and gas, like polluters, to pay, basically. And it's hard to disentangle that kind of motivation without more qualitative techniques. So the survey can kind of get us into the what does the pattern look like, but to understand the why behind it, we would need to do a bit more work.
On the basis of my research, what I would just say there is that Imperial was very sure that it thought the responsibility lied with the federal government. So lots and lots of language saying that most of this responsibility should lie with the federal government. We're willing to help and so on and so forth, but that's where they thought the burden should lie primarily.
And to that, the entity that could force Imperial to pay is the feds, which is an interesting tension, right? So.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Erika Rias. I'm with Alberta Innovates. Thank you so much for this presentation. I am a fellow engineer, so give me a technical problem, I'll solve it. What you're trying to do is super difficult and complex and impressive, so thank you for this. My question is regarding what you spoke of, Melanee, on that, giving all this information to regular folk and asking them to make a decision on this can be overwhelming. And to be honest, it can be overwhelming for all of us, even though we know all the technical issues that are associated with implementing CDR solution and actually the unintended consequences of them in a technical perspective. But on a policy perspective, what do you think would be the best way to go? Is it to give everyone all the knowledge, right? Because sometimes giving them a polarizing approach can be worse than giving them an and solution, right? Either, instead of telling them we need to transition, telling them we need to diversify, we need to reduce carbon intensity, and explain what carbon intensity is and how that carbon intensity comes to be. And so how could you formulate a solution? Is it knowledge sharing with everybody, or is it more giving them the information just to explain it? Like, this is a very complex thing. I really have a hard time understanding this and trying to come up with a solution. We can do the technical side, but then how do we get people on board, and how do we get policymakers on board on supporting this? Thank you.
I can answer that one. Definitely the answer is participatory policymaking, right? Consulting stakeholders and rights holders. That was the issue in Brazil, right? As I said, it was a dictatorship. They had the great idea, ethanol, but they didn't consult with people, so that's why they had all these negative unintended consequences. Land use, growing sugarcane everywhere into delicate, fragile ecosystems because they didn't ask the people who live there, would this work here in your ecosystem? And so the idea of consultation with rights holders and stakeholders, more perspectives. You need people who think outside the technological box, to think about the potential unintended consequences that could happen. The possibilistic thinking requires the public to be involved so they can think outside the box and highlight to policymakers what is obvious to the people who live there, what could go wrong, but is not obvious to the people making policies. So that's the one big strategy to sort of mitigate against unintended consequences of new technologies, participation.
And then from a public opinion perspective, the key to understanding this is that information is costly. Like, think about how long it took the people in the room who understand the engineering well to learn what they needed to learn to even get the basics of the engineering. Regular folk are not going to do that. Regular folk want to make it through the day. They want to manage their families and their lives, and they want to find a bit of joy, subversive or otherwise. They kind of just, so we would call this rational ignorance or rational disengagement, but the thing I would point out is that this is one of the reasons why the assumption that people should have perfect information or people should know needs to die, because they're never going to. They're never going to, and I would actually say that that's okay. If we look at how people learn over the course of, say, an election campaign, there are people who know all the things that we think as researchers in voting behavior think that they should know to be able to ballpark figure out how they might vote. And then there are the people who have been paying absolutely no attention, and they clock in at the beginning of the campaign. And even for super short Canadian campaigns for 28 days, people learn what they need to learn by the end of it. And so my question would be, who needs to know? Because I don't think it's necessarily regular folk. What regular folk need would be if we're going to go in this direction, why are we doing it? And what can I expect? What are the benefits? What are the costs? That kind of public consultation to get a clear-eyed view of what's happening, but actually digging into the details of that stuff, I would say that this is not. You could put it into something like a citizens' assembly or something participatory, but those get exhausting really quickly and unwielding really quickly. And so part of it would be public opinion is one thing, regular folk are one thing, but actually doing the details of the policy, that rests with other people, I think, which is okay. Yeah. An endorsement, yeah.
Endorsement, usually when we don't have a lot of information and we had to make decisions, decisions are not just based on data. Typically it's not. It's based on who is telling you those messages, who's delivering those benefits, how they have access to the benefits, in a plain language, and if they align with their values. So it's also knowing the people and the right messages.
And I will end on this, the thing that we're dancing around, and it is much more normative. So full circle, I've been saying, don't be normative, and then I will end on the normative bit. Our leaders need to actually take responsibility for leading on this stuff. And so at the risk of outing myself as a pox on all their houses, this idea of using these policies as instruments for things like partisan fights, because that's an easy short-term win, is toxic and corrosive to actually doing something. about this stuff. And so I look at some of the people who are empowered by institutions of the state with chagrin, because if I'm looking at who should be responsible for this stuff and like learning and doing a better job, it's not regular folk, but it certainly is their elected representatives. And I don't see lots of people in those positions doing the job the way that they need to do. And I say that as a political scientist who has a preference for good public policy. I'm leaving aside my other personal preferences for this, of which I can be very salty about, and if you ask me about them, maybe I will tell you, but not from here.
Great, thank you so much. Can you join me with a round of applause for the People in Perspectives panelists?